We want to welcome everybody to our exponential webinar. My name's Dave Ferguson, and we're going to be doing a series of these, and they're all around our theme, our big idea for 2026 called Good, Great, and Greater. And it's based right out of John chapter 14, verse 12. And it's this kind of wild passage where Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, the things you've seen me do, you guys are going to do even greater things. And really, we see it as a challenge that what Jesus wants to do through us is something both uh, qualitatively greater, but also quantitatively greater, both kind of more and better. And during the conference, the first time we'll get a chance to do it in a gathering will be our global conference coming up in March. And we're going to be talking about greater things for your leadership, greater things for the church, and also greater things for your city, but challenging everybody to think in terms of how can I be a multiplier? And for those of you who are new to Exponential, when we talk about being a multiplier, we're talking about a healthy disciple-making leader that champions reproduction. So a healthy disciple-making leader that champions reproduction. And we have with us a friend of mine, and also is going to be on the main stage. One of our speakers, I'm really excited about, is Drew Hyun. And I was giving Drew a little bit of a hard time, but I'm genuinely excited about actually having this conversation with him and having you all be a part of it. Because when I think about people who are multipliers, this idea of healthy disciple-making leaders that champion reproduction, I mean, Drew's like one of the people that comes to mind. He's really trying to lead a healthy life, um, in all respects and all domains, but he also is someone who is championing reproduction, a disciple maker. Let me give you a little bit of, I'm going to give you guys, for maybe some of you don't know all the things that Drew's up to. I'll read his bio and then I'll welcome you. Okay, Drew, so we'll hang in there. Drew's the founder and lead pastor of Hope Church in New York City, a diverse church with 3 locations in New York. He's also the executive director of Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, an organization that aims to transform church culture through the multiplication of deeply changed pastors and leaders. Drew also co-founded the New City Network, a network of urban churches that value multi-ethnicity, spirit-filled ministry, emotional health, and mission. And he also has a brand new book out, just came out last month, I think. Beautiful, Disappointing, Hopeful, How Gratitude, Grief, and Grace Reflect the Christian Story. And he lives in New York with his wife, Christina, their son, David, and daughter, Avery. Hey, thanks for joining me, Drew.
Honored to be here, Dave. This is fun. Anytime I get to spend with you is really just a blast. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I will, before we jump in, I got a bunch of questions here. Some that I kind of gave Drew ahead of time, so he could be thinking about. Others I've thought about since then. But even more important, those of you joining us, if you have questions that as we're talking that you would love, particularly for Drew to respond to, go ahead and just drop those in the Q&A, and we'll try to make sure we hit those. Um, so don't hesitate to do that. We, more than what we have to say, we really want to respond to kind of what your questions are to make sure we're helping you as best we possibly can. And I think what we're going to do is I want to kind of start with kind of the better things, greater things for your leadership, which is part of what we have you speaking on at Exponential. Let's just, maybe we could, let's start with John 14:12.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a crazy thing when you actually think about, I mean, Jesus saying that to people, not any different than me or you, or those of you that are listening. Hey, the things you've seen me do, you're going to even greater things. What do you think means when he says that, not only to them back then, but also to us today?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have to do is often I need to filter out what even that word greater means. I know
Okay.
that in today's world, I think there's a certain way that we think about greater. We think about uh, successful things on the outside that are gleaming and big, and even in the church. And, one of the things about the whole Gospel of John, so much of it is about the confounding message of Jesus that it's in his death that he's glorified. It's like he feeds the thousands and then he gives this hard teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And obviously he's speaking metaphorically. And then the crowds begin to scatter. And it's almost like Jesus has this different rhythm, definition of what greatness looks like
Hmm.
and what success looks like. And and so, yes, on one hand, like there is a greatness to what Jesus is saying he's going to give to his disciples. And I think for us, hopefully, with those who have ears to hear, that we would be a people who are tuned into what greatness really looks like. But it's not defined by kind of normal metrics of what greatness might look like in the world, but instead it's defined by a keenness and a closeness to Jesus. I find it so interesting that right after this, he's going to, in
Mm.
John 15, he's going to say, abide in me and as I abide in you. And then he talks about how um, apart from me, you can do nothing. And in many ways, he's almost centering our greatness in the level of how deeply we remain tethered to Jesus, more than tethered to, external measurements of success and what greatness might looks like. Like the real measurement of success is, will you remain tethered to me? Will you abide in me and remain in me? And and what's amazing is that Jesus says, if you remain in me, you will bear much fruit. And I need to often remember, like, oftentimes I think of greatness as like bearing fruit. And I think I have to work hard on bearing fruit. And Jesus is like, no, no, no. If you remain in me, like that's the number one priority. If you remain in me, you will bear much fruit. So it's almost like um, instead of focusing on the fruit, focus on remaining in the true vine, which is Jesus. So I realize that's kind of a topsy-turvy way of thinking about it, but I think that's what Jesus is all about when he talks about greatness in the world.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, let's do this then. So as you think about that, then so first he says you're gonna do greater things, but then you're right, right after that, the whole passage about remain in me and abide in me, and you'll bear much fruit. Does that mean like, and again, I'd love to hear as much as you're comfortable, Drew's
Yeah.
story.
Yeah. I,
What's where does that intersect with you and your story, and as a leader, some things you've had to learn?
yeah, I, um, I was birthed into this world with succeed or die. And part of that was my immigrant story. Like my parents immigrated to the country. At the time, Korea was like this war-torn place. And so my parents, like their dreams for me was they're going to give up everything so that I and my brothers could succeed in the
So
United States.
were you born in South Korea?
No, I was born in Southern California.
Okay, but
Uh,
your parents were.
yeah, my parents were, so they
Were they from
immigrated.
were they from Seoul?
Yep, they were from
Okay.
Seoul. And they came here and like so the immigrant hustle was we bought a one-way ticket, we left a foreign land, or we left our homeland to join this foreign land so that our kids could build a new life. So you could imagine the amount of pressure that I felt as a kid to achieve at school. And it was kind of like, we didn't move to this country so that, you can get B's and C's or whatever.
Oh,
And
right.
now, so you can imagine, so like in my family of origin, there's already this emphasis on achievement and doing great things and working really, really hard. And there was no other option other than that. And so like external measurements of what success looks like I naturally then grew up just wanting to achieve things. And naturally, when I discovered the gospel of Jesus Christ, it was like the most beautiful thing because it was a gospel of God's grace and goodness towards us. And of course, then I become a Christian. And once I become a Christian, though, I'm like, I want to crush this Christian thing, you know? And then the emphasis,
Were your parents believers?
yeah, my parents were believers.
Okay,
Uh,
but Jesus became real for you. So okay, you know what? I may not be a doctor or a lawyer, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to be a kicking pastor.
Absolutely. And so
Right.
you could imagine then, now, of course, it was the gospel of grace that drew me to Jesus. And mission was what captivated me because I wanted people to know this Jesus. But now all of a sudden, though, it starts to get intermingled with all of these different shadow sides to my own soul about what greatness looks like and about success and what measurements of success look like. And I would often hear this adage, like in church plant training, it was healthy things grow. And it took me a while to remember, though, that uh, so do so do weeds and cancer, and unhealthy things grow too. And so while it's true that healthy things grow, unhealthy things grow too. And so the question for me, because it was
And
so
sometimes
easy.
they grow side by side.
Absolutely. And that's one of the mysteries of what God does. Now God uses, like Paul talks about in the book of Philippians, like whether false motives are true, the gospel is preached, and for that I rejoice. And so it's true that it's all intermingled. But now that as I think about Craig Rochelle uses this phrase, which I loved. He would say, "I would do anything short of sin to reach those far from God."
Yeah.
And I realized that early on in my church plant journey, I would say that to myself, I'm going to do anything short of sin to reach those far from God. But then I realized in those early days as well, like I was actually sinning to reach those far from God.
Mm.
I was living beyond my limits. I would be someone who would neglect my family um, at various times to reach those far from God. Now, again, that's not to basically say that, and like you said, like um, it grows side by side often, right? Like the fruit and the wheat and
Oh
the
yeah.
weeds. But what does it look like for me then to, again, when it comes down to like, what does greatness and success look like? I think immediately in my American kind of Christian view, and I shouldn't even just say American, just Western kind of, or just even in the world today, like so much of what we think about what success looks like is so shaped uh, by a very kind of linear up and to the right kind of imagination. And I am all for that. Believe me, I am all for that. However, I've had to begin to reshape my imagination of what greatness looks like. And really, the number one goal in that is John 15, to remain in Jesus. If I can do that, um, the
Was
rest.
was I mean that I mean, and I think I know you well enough, and this has been my experience. It's something you learn and relearn. You don't like one time get it right and you're good from then on.
Yeah,
But was there for you a certain point where I mean you look back on it in your own story, you're going like, okay, I there was kind of a conversion about that. There was kind of an inflection point where okay, I'm not going to get it perfect, but I'm not going back.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And a big part of my story was when in my formational years as a Christian leader, I was on staff at New Life Fellowship with Pete Scazzero with Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. So being in a church ecosystem where, again, it was being before doing and how that became the center. And then, what's been interesting for me too was, so then I was on staff with Pete for 10 years. And during those 10 years, the church on the outside had remarkable growth uh, like externally. But I saw how the engine of it was really from this abiding posture. Then I went off to plant a church, and then it became a family of churches. Was so like captivated by the mission of multiplication, and we were raising up and sending out church leaders, and then we started this family of churches, and then we started a network. We were very influenced by exponential. Felt so captivated. Felt so like moved by God, the mission of multiplication um, and doing it in a healthy way. And then I think what happened was COVID, during COVID, there was such especially in New York City, there was this incredible referendum on leadership that was happening, uh,
Hmm.
particularly around leadership health. Some were more publicized in the broader media, and a lot of it just happened even, far from the eyes of the media. I just saw that pastors and leaders were really struggling and that wow, this issue of health. Um, I used to think, oh yeah, the health thing. It may prevent us from being more missional because we're going to focus on being healthy. But now, after having been through those seasons of desert and difficulty, I realized there is nothing more important to mission than health because it doesn't matter how quickly something can ascend, it can drop just as fast. But unless the foundation, unless the roots of what we're building are deeply seeped in abiding in Jesus first and foremost, then what we end up building end up becoming really a house of cards that are bound to fall. And so, in many ways, that led me to even double down more into emotional health and realize that health is that's number one to mission. And that's one of the reasons why I love Exponential talks about how our mission is multiplication, multiplying healthy, and that was a very intentional move on Exponential's part, is saying that, hey,
And let me just too say, and you influenced that. So thank you.
well, I'm honored to say to hear that, but I realize it's because of my propensity, because like I said, from my family of origin, from my own kind of competitive spirit, and like I can so quickly veer into shadow missions and into like motivators for mission that lead me far from the heart of Jesus. And it's so um I realize I can get into autopilot about ministry and mission that I lose out on the thing that I signed up for this thing in the first place for, was that remarkable encounter with the amazing grace of God. And somehow whenever I lose that posture and I lose that my own kind of self in the midst of, what greatness looks like, that's when I end up losing out on the very thing that Jesus had invited me to in the first place, which was abiding in him.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is exactly, I think, the reason I was excited about this conversation. One was to talk to you, but also for other people to hear the conversation, because I do think there's the exponential crowd is not dissimilar than you or kind of me. It's highly apostolic, highly evangelistic. Probably, yeah, we do kind of, if we're honest, probably have a little bit of an addiction, anything up and to the right, and we want to make a huge difference. Yes, for Jesus, but it kind of feels good on the way. So we
Mhm.
have to be careful. Um, and I think for us and to all hear you remind us about, this transformation thing is mission critical to multiplication, because if that's not happening, then you're right. It all comes tumbling down. So thank you. And again, I want to remind everybody listening in, this is not just for Drew and I. If you guys got questions you'd love for Drew to respond to, yeah, drop them in the Q&A. We got a couple people here that are looking at the questions. They'll make sure we get them. We'd love to respond to them so we can help you, where you're leading. Let me ask you this, okay?
Yeah.
Thanks for the transparency. Thanks for the, and I didn't expect anything different, candidly, but thank you. If you could wave a magic wand, I don't know if this question works, and if you could wave a magic wand and change two or three things and make it as practical as you possibly can about church leadership in the American church. Okay. You get to be the Pope for the American church. And
Yeah.
you get to say, hey, starting today, you're going to sign, a declaration that changes everything. Are there going like, here's two or three things that, man, based on the experience I've had and what I see, because you get to see the American church at a different point of view than a lot of folks. Um, what would you change?
I would change. I would emphasize the inner life of a leader. So, uh, the soul, the beneath the surface things, the stuff that really begins to be part of the fabric of someone's character. And I would try to slow us down. So those would be two things: a slow down spirituality and a discipleship that goes beneath the surface. Uh, both of those things, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, but perhaps fortunately and maybe prophetically, they take time. Like, I need to slow down my pace so that I can be growing in self-awareness around my shadow, around my heart, around my life and vibrancy with Jesus. Um, and I need to do discipleship with people then is not just perfunctory, hey, you said a prayer, you're serving, like things are good. It's no, it's what does it mean to really disciple people? Like Jesus spent a disproportionate amount of his time with his disciples. And look at the movement that's come out of that. And one of the things I love about Exponential has been the emphasis on discipleship. And the reality is discipleship is not it's not mass produced. It's I think I heard it's handcrafted. It's life on life. It involves intentionally investing in someone else. I know your book on Hero Maker like had such a model for what that looks like. And oftentimes ministry can become so externally driven, uh, how great the platform looks and how, how influential one can be in the digital space. But really, at the end of the day, like it's life on life, and that life on life, hopefully invites us into a deeper level of discipleship that is more than just like, hey, sign off on this statement of faith, get baptized one time, start serving in this area. It's we begin to explore with one another. How do we begin to look more like Jesus? um, in our public life and our private life, especially our private life. And just for us to slow down and model that for our people, that we model a life of receiving the gift of Sabbath rest. And it's out of that rest that we're working and we're producing and we're reaching and we're hopefully. I was just in a conversation with a few other pastors, and they were sharing about how Barna's statistics, like a few years ago, one of the big reasons why people considered like the biggest kind of draw for evangelism was around evidence, so that's where all these books around evidence that demands a verdict, Lee Strobel's work with Case for Christ and things like that. And then the big question that the generation wrestled with was purpose, which is where Rick Warren's book on purpose-driven life became so important. And in recent statistics, the greatest witness to this next generation, the thing that draws people the most, um, that gives them a signal of like, wow, I really want what you have, is actually inner peace. Like, and my question is the Church of Jesus Christ, like we have this incredible opportunity to witness to the world, and what the question is, what are we propagating and multiplying? Are
Yeah.
we multiplying like these success-driven oriented kind of folks, which again, that's part of our story, and that's something that I really am drawn to. But is there also a certain kind of peace that comes from our inner life, who we show up as in the world, in our organizations, in our churches, and things like that?
It's interesting you say that. Have you read this yet?
Yeah, yeah,
I
Jonathan
mean,
Haidt.
right. I mean, it's called the book Anxious Generation. I'm actually going through with my son Caleb. But I mean, he talks about. I mean, the a lot of it appears as though a lot of it got triggered by the introduction of the smartphone, and then also social media, and the residual of that is, yeah, a whole lot of anxiety, a whole lot of depression, exactly the opposite of what you're talking about, inner peace.
Yeah.
And it totally makes sense that we now live in an era, or perhaps, a generation, an anxious generation, who that's the one thing they're looking for right now. Okay,
Mm,
I'll tell you what, you show me where I can find that peace, and I'm interested. I'm
yeah,
interested. Um,
yeah.
Let me ask you this, because I want to pick up on something that you said too. And again, I think we got a couple questions coming in, and we'll get to those. Um, you wave the magic wand, people slow down, they do real life on life kind of discipleship. They're doing this stuff in community. There has been a tidal wave
Hmm.
of particularly senior level leaders that we've seen. Um, I don't know how you want to characterize it. Fall, exposed, leading double lives, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And those are probably only the ones on larger platforms, because those are the ones that make the news. But it's happening at every level. Um, if if those people, if all of us, I don't want to say those people,
Yeah.
if we would all slow down and do discipleship like that, is that the antidote? Is that the cure?
Uh, I I mean, obviously I don't know if that's secure, but I know that there would be less of that happening if both of those things, slowing down and taking a look at our own discipleship and discipling others in a deep transformational way, if those things did become a priority, I believe we have a better chance. I think there's something in the waters of, again, the ways that we measure success and the ways that platforms and again, our definitions of greatness can spoil like the real essence and heart of why we decided to follow Jesus in the first place. Um, there's actually, Jim Collins wrote the book Good to Great,
Yeah.
and I love the book. I mean, it's one of my favorites, and it's this book on, how can organizations go from good to great, and
Right.
case studies on various. And Jae-hoon Lee, who's a pastor in South Korea, he wrote a book called Great to Good.
Really? I did not
And
know
he
that.
and he wrote about how it's the quality of, and Scott McKnight wrote a book called A Church Called Tov,
Yeah.
and Tov being the Hebrew word for good, goodness. And again, part of it is, again, even just that switch of language, like I generally am, yeah, I want good to great. I want to be great. And Jesus is like, if you want to be great, you got to be the servant of all. And A Church Called Tov, it's this idea of goodness, that goodness is what we're after. And I heard this phrase, what does it look like for us to share the good news in a good way? And what ends up doing harm to the church is when we share the good news, but we do it in a bad way. And oftentimes those stories that, those that are publicized and those that aren't, it's usually a cry for help from these pastors and leaders who've been living kind of these shadow lives. And it's because they neglected, usually it's their inner life, their shadow, uh, became increasingly isolated and lonely. Um, and we're probably living with very little margin. Uh, and as a result, they become disconnected from their families, from those close to them. And Dave, I'd love to hear from you. Dave, could you just share, because I remember meeting with you about this health, how you actually in your journal, you would actually write down and you would take a temperature check on your own self and soul. Would you be up to share some of that? Because I started doing that physically.
Oh, did
Um,
you really? How do you
yeah,
do it?
just to take, because I remember you would actually put like a number grade
Oh,
according to
yeah.
like, how are you doing relationally?
But you have to be careful with that too, because I mean, it's
Yeah,
like,
I know, because it can become performative, but
oh yeah.
just the fact that you were doing the work of like, and that's what I mean is like taking the time to pause. And Alcoholics Anonymous talks about taking a fearless kind of inventory.
Fearless moral inventory. Yeah.
Yeah, and like it's kind of that same idea. Like, am I regularly taking an inventory, and are there people close to me that are helping me take, an inventory? And so, yeah, would you be down to share some of that? Because I love that tool that you shared.
Yeah. I mean, and I think what you're referring to is the RPMs.
Hmm.
It's yeah. So I mean, it's something that I do well every day I journal, which is almost every day. My intention is to do it every day.
Hmm.
Uh, and I was in Kansas City this morning and I flew back to Chicago. And so on the plane, I did it. I'm doing a little bit different now because I'm experimenting with different things because I think I'm gonna may include it in my next book about how to, but like so now I'm actually doing it with red, green, and yellow
Yeah.
with also num but basically the overarching, which is it's interesting you said this. So like, and I'll just show you without showing you everything on my journal. Like, this is my this morning, and I always start with "Good morning, Holy Spirit, guide me or us today." And it's funny. It's interesting. You went to that. The abide and remain. I always like every day. I write down this. Right now, I abide. I remain in Christ.
Wow.
And I like for me, I need that reminder. And um it's both from my side and I think God's side that He wants me to remain and I choose to remain. And if I choose it, then He'll have me. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
And so it's just
absolutely.
like this. And then I do something here, or you being a hero maker, and I circle one or the other. But then you're right. Then I do these, and I write down RPMS, relational, physical, mental, spiritual.
Mhm.
And for those of you who may have not heard me talk about this before, basically, it's my attempt to kind of try to do some of the things Drew's talked about for a very, very long time. And so and it literally only takes me, I mean, 2 or 3 minutes.
Mm.
But if you reflect on it every day, like, okay, how am I doing relationally? And I gave myself a green, like it was good because like even though I was in Kansas City, I got to hang, Troy McMahon.
Yeah, yeah.
Rob Wagner, those guys. So they're in our New Thing network, and Troy and I go way back. So I got to have dinner with Troy, and I got to see Rob and see some other people, even though I was speaking at some stuff. So that's green. Physically, I was at a green, but it went down. And everybody, just to tell everybody too, the reason there's so many greens is because positivity is on my strength finder. So it's never really as good as I think. But the more important thing isn't really the red, green, yellow, or even the score. It's more like just reflecting on it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's down because I was so tired last night. I didn't get a run in yesterday, so I was like, okay, suck. Mentally, that's more kind of like how am I doing emotionally, and I'm trying to use the feeling wheel because I'm one of those people I have to think about how I
Mm.
feel,
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
and then spiritually, and then I give myself kind of a composite score. So yeah, I mean that's my kind of way of every day kind of trying to do it, and the way I would describe it is it keeps me from drifting. I think, well, we all drift. You're always
Hmm.
going to drift, but maybe a better way to put it, it actually recalibrates, it realigns, and it makes me admit, hopefully, when I'm drifting. So yeah,
Yeah, I love that. And I have a daily journal as well that I do. And I practice a daily office, which is pausing throughout the day.
yep.
So I spend every morning, so silence and solitude is a significant part of my day. So I'll spend 20 minutes in silence. There
When do you do that?
I do that early in the morning. So like uh 5:30 in the morning or so
Okay.
is when I do the bigger chunk of silence. Um, sorry, I realize I'm speaking with more specificity because I figure that might be more helpful to folks.
Yeah,
Um,
it is to me.
yeah, and then I will, so I'll, as part of my silence, and then I'm also, and then I'll meditate on scripture. And then I'll do an inventory around my rule of life, which in emotionally healthy discipleship, we divide our rule of life in prayer, rest, relationships, and work. And so I've got certain goals for each of those, um, ways to keep me tethered to Jesus in the midst of that. And then every midday, I'll take some time of silence and prayer as well. And in the evening before I go to bed, I'll do silence, prayer, and I'll do what's called the examine, which is
Yeah.
an exercise and just practicing what are the moments in which I sensed God in the day. And what are the moments in which I felt dread and felt like I was apart from God during the day? And so we'll do some confession and repentance and practicing gratitude, grief, and grace. Like those things are regularly just on my mind and heart. Um, and then Sabbath keeping is a big one in terms of like a 24-hour period to stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. So, but I realize that when I'm running too hard, gosh, I'm just a poor version of myself, and it's bound to end up hurting me and other people, um, sadly. And so I realize when I'm outside of my rhythms, I tend to, I think the worst parts of me come out. And so that's how I kind of do an inventory is those regular daily, the weekly Sabbaths, and we do sabbaticals and things like that. Yeah.
And so the silent solitude part, did I get that right? So there's three chunks of 20 minutes each.
No, there's just 20 minutes in the morning is my biggest chunk of silence.
Okay. And then, but there's times where you pause the other two places.
Yeah, yeah. So my midday pause is anywhere from 3 minutes to 5 minutes. So it's not long. I've got
Yeah,
a
I
little,
mean, that's totally doable.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'll just sit in my little chair. And so even right before this, just put the timer on. I have this
Oh,
little
you
chime.
you actually put a timer on.
I do. It helps me.
Yeah, that kind of I love hearing that kind of stuff because yeah, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's like an invitation for me, like just the holiness of silence and pausing before the Lord and just getting clear, um, before God. So, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, anybody, if you know, if you got questions for Drew about some of those practices and what he does to try to not just write about and teach about emotional health, but actually live it himself, that's jump in here, ask questions. I got a whole bunch of other things I would love to ask, but Joe, don't, if you're listening, you got questions, please do, please do. Um, so now I'm thinking about um, multiplication, what it means to be a multiplier.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to back up a little bit. Let me ask you this real quick. This is a little bit of a trick question, but see what happens.
Yeah.
You know what exponential we talk about the 16% mission?
Yep.
What is that? How do you understand that?
I understand it as bec well, so in the
Just give
broadest
it a shot.
term, the
Yeah,
first thing that came to mind is being about God's kingdom, not my own.
right.
Yep.
And what
And
we're wanting to see is we would like to see 16% of all churches
yes,
become reproducing and multiplying churches who exactly hold that demeanor.
absolutely. 100%.
So that's where we're championing this thing, multiplier.
Yes.
So now talk to me about, because I know you believe this and are motivated by it. Why is it so important that not only for Drew that you live that life, but I mean, like I read your bio, it's I mean, you're not only leading the church, you're also leading emotionally healthy discipleship and organization. Your church has, you know, multiple locations. You're also leading a network. You also got a new book coming out. All right.
Yeah.
So all that's going on. Why is it so important that you do those things in light of that stuff? How does just talk about the interplay between those two things?
Yeah. And again, I think it starts from hopefully my inner life and my relationships. Like, if all of that goes haywire, everything else, like, who cares if the church is growing and expanding? At the end of the day, who I am inevitably bears itself upon our church community, my family, and the people around me. And that's where, again, the scriptures talk about footholds that Satan uses. And so my primary job description, in fact, my primary job description is to love Jesus with all my heart, soul, strength, and mind, to abide in Jesus, and to love my first neighbor, which is my wife and my children well.
That's all.
And if any of that so that's part of my rule of life. So now there's a lot of things though that I need to say no to so that I can say yes to that and say yes to the work that God has called me to. I mean, one little example of this, and I just realized this is kind of, I don't even know why. Maybe it comes to mind because I did just write a book.
Yeah.
Like about 5 years ago, was when I first got approached about writing a book. And I remember just feeling so honored and flattered. And it was from a publisher I had never heard of, but I was just like, oh, well, wow, like someone wants to, I have something worthwhile to say.
Yeah,
And
no, it's way cool.
then what was interesting was a lot of like close friends of mine were starting to write books right around the same time. And I, you know, but then for whatever reason, I just knew that with the margin of my life and the age that my kids were at the time, and they were young, just kind of just getting out of diapers. Like I just
Yep.
knew that it demanded a lot of attention from me. And I looked at my rule of life and I realized that I just like writing a book, it just wasn't, it's, I just could not do it during that time. So I said no. And then meanwhile, these friends and contemporaries who wrote these books, like these books started to do really well. And I like, they start, and there was a part of me that was honestly, I felt really jealous and was kind of like, oh man, like I could write a book. And, like there were just parts of me that
I could
I
I
just had to
could I
be,
could write a better book,
yeah, yeah. I
right?
wasn't even,
I
it
mean,
was,
I know you do that stuff in your head.
I
You
know.
got
And then this whole comparison thing. And then I'm just kind of like, and meanwhile, Pete Scazzaro, who was my mentor, Pete would just tell me about like, Drew, like writing a book is like there's a lot of shadow sides to it.
yeah,
And so,
easy for him to say. He's sold, you know, half million
yeah.
copies.
I know, I know, I know.
I'm
And
trying to
so
get my first one out.
I know. So I just said to Pete, I said, Pete, I'm just going to follow your lead on this. But I
Mm,
realized that like the temptation for me and and again, that's where the worldly stuff started to come out was like the competitiveness around like, oh, well, that person's writing a book. Like I could write a book. And, but coming back to a place of like, wait, what's like, my goal is abiding in Jesus. And if my rule of life, which I've prayerfully kind of crafted with, and a rule of life is an intentional plan to follow Jesus.
yep.
If that's if that has a certain frame around it for Tina and I in this season of our lives, this means invariably I cannot do this right now. So we ended up just saying no, or I said no to it for a few years. And I remember Pete was the one, I said, Pete, you're my mentor, you've been down this road. I will only do it if you say yes. If you say no, I've given this to God in a place where, Henry Nouwen has this phrase of praying with open hands.
Yeah.
And like, it's with open hands writing a book. Maybe one day it's not in the cards for me. And I'm willing to follow Pete as you know my life and my journey. And Pete was actually the one that's like, Drew, I think you should actually start writing something now. Uh, and so that was kind of and now my kids are older, so
Yeah.
they're not at home nearly as much. So like there was more margin in my life.
Yeah.
Um, so like things like that have just been um, again, it's Eugene Peterson has this phrase where he says, "You are busy because you are lazy."
Mm.
And I remember reading that from Eugene Peterson. I was like, "Oh, wow!" Like I was like, I don't think of lazy people as the busy, or the busy people as the lazy
What does
people.
that mean? What does that mean to you? And why was that so powerful? You're
So
busy because you're
he
lazy.
So he goes on to say, he says, you're lazy about prioritizing the wrong
Mm.
things. And so you
Okay.
end up saying yes to everything without prayerfully considering what is the thing that God has before you. Because once you've been able to figure out what God has before you, you're able to say no to the things that are not of God. It's almost like that example of Jesus. He feeds the 5,000, and crowds of people are following him. And then he gives this really harsh teaching. And it says that people start to flee. And he says to Peter, Simon Peter, like, do you want to leave too? And Simon Peter says, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And it's almost like if I were Jesus, I mean, after I fed the 5,000, he's a rock star. People are following him. And he
Yep.
actually says to them, like, you came because you were fed. And like in today's world, it'd be like, oh, hey, this is your viral moment, Jesus. Like, this is when you capitalize on that and you go for it. This is when you build your ministry. And somehow he's got such inner fortitude that he's able to be like, no, this is not, people are following this because of their stomachs were filled. But like, I've got a different kind of mission. And there's something so differentiated, so like abiding in the vine of Jesus. Now, obviously, Son of God, like there's something about his differentiated self where he's able to say no to what the world and what the disciples and what others might see as success so that he can do what he's supposed to do, which is success is, Pete Scazzero often says, success is doing God's will, God's way, and in God's time.
God's will, God's way, and God's time. That's good. That's really good.
And most of the time for us, we think of success as it's the biggest thing that happens the fastest in the shortest amount of time. And the younger you are, the more you'll be celebrated. And it's like, well, if that's God's will for the person, that's great. If it's God's will for people, um, around me to be writing and building platforms and like me starting to feel jealous and why is that? And that's what I love about exponential because that 16% mission, fundamentally, it says it's not about you. It's about the
No.
kingdom. And if it's about the kingdom, then you're actually willing to go to the grave so that others might live. And what I love, and that's really what it's going to take for churches to become reproducing churches. It's saying it's not about my thing. I mean, and this is what I love about your posture, Dave. And again, Hero Maker, it's cool that you write that in your journal. I didn't even know that, but um, I like it's so kingdom. And the Western church is captivated by competition consumerism, celebrity, and influence. And I need to constantly recenter and be like, it's the kingdom of God. And that's where multiplication should be an outflow of the kind of character of humility, generosity, um, a hero maker kind of spirit that hopefully lends us towards wanting to serve others more than us be served.
Okay, I want to jump in here because probably with people who are listening in, and particularly kind of the exponential crowd who we like kind of acknowledge, hey, is more apostolic, is more evangelistic. They love seeing, taking nothing and seeing something come to life. In business terms, you'd call them entrepreneurs, those kind of folks. Okay, I think maybe I think you're a good example of this, and maybe it's something we're all learning. And is this is you don't have to be in a hurry to do something and really significant. And again, I think most people would look at you, and I think it's just a right assessment that, oh, okay, Drew is making a difference with his life.
Mm.
He's helped start a church that's multiplying. He's helping start other churches. There's a network. He's invested himself in in this in the healthy discipleship, the org. He's also now having opportunities to write books. How old are you, Drew?
I'm 45.
45. Okay. And so and yeah, and you still have a long runway.
Yeah.
So, if you're in your 20s or your early 30s, I mean, I hope what you're hearing here is this inner transformation. Keep working on that and trust that and trust the
Yes.
gifts that God's given you, because if you keep working on that and trust the gifts God's given you, the stuff's going to follow, so to speak.
Yes.
Am I right
Yeah.
about that?
100%.
And so, like, yeah, just remember, I mean, unless God has a different, you probably got 40, 50 years. And so let's not be in a big hurry about it. It's going to come. But do those things. And here's the other thing. And I don't know if a story comes to mind. We'll see if it does or not. So you talked about some of like your rule of life. You've talked about, the moments of silence and on a daily basis. Because you've tried to be disciplined about that for a number of years now, how do you see that reproduced in the lives of other people?
Yeah. So I, I think, again, hopefully what I'm
You got any
modeling,
stories? You got a story for us?
yeah, I, well, fundamentally, even in church, like, I mean, gosh, I've even evolved some now. Like, I realize now that if I'm not helping people, because that philosophy is if the number one goal on anyone's job description is to be before you do,
Hmm.
first, I have to be living that. And then that then becomes the thing that I'm focused on when it comes to discipling others. Believing that the kind of the same thing is true, that same flywheel. So right now, so my direct reports and the folks that I am discipling right now, the young
Yep.
leaders that I'm investing in, um, that's my first question to them is about being before doing, is about their inner life.
And what's that look like? Are they actually doing the stuff?
Yeah, we actually have a rule of life for our preaching team. We're actually inviting, we're in it, with emotional healthy discipleship, we're actually now inviting lead pastors of other churches to actually commit to a common rule of life where we actually commit to a higher bar of silence and solitude, rest, and where we actually have these different bands of folks that will keep each other accountable monthly. Because here's one of the things that I realized, Dave, and be curious to get your feedback on this. Like, in my experience, like elder boards, especially for like founding pastors,
Yeah.
elder boards are kind of ill-equipped to keep pastors accountable spiritually. And part of it is these elder boards are usually like they're like, aren't you the pastor? You should be keeping us accountable. Like we don't like so there's a certain kind of awkwardness there. And I realize that denominations and networks sometimes they're so large, it's very difficult to give individual attention. And so we've realized that there's a pretty significant gap for pastors and leaders where there's true kind of vulnerable accountability as well as a North Star for like what exactly do we mean by like what does health look like? And so what we've started to do at Emotional Healthy Discipleship is we're in the process of creating a rule of life where we're saying, hey, here's specific things, guidelines. Now, I realize it's not for everyone, and some people might be like, that sounds so legalistic, and it's not. That's why it's an opt-in kind of thing. Like, are you willing to commit? And you opt in every year. Are you willing to commit to this kind of rhythm of silence, solitude, Sabbath keeping, scripture engagement, exercise? Um, rhythms of meeting with a therapist or spiritual
Mm.
director. Like we've got things really, really specified for pastors and leaders. Um, and so we're recognizing that having a rule of life, keeping folks accountable to that rule of life is super important. And so my task then in discipleship is helping others with their rule of life, their own journey with Jesus, being able to give feedback at appropriate points and moments around that same rule of life that we've all agreed to, and then hopefully modeling for others about what that kind of multiplication looks like in loving Jesus. Now, part of that rule of life is also
Yeah,
mission and reproduction. Now, the again, the issue oftentimes in the churches, oftentimes our discipleship models can doesn't get nearly as deep enough, um, and more so becomes more about, helping build this big church rather than multiplying truly transformed disciples. So that's kind of what that looks like in my day to day. So my meetings with the people that I'm discipling, who are my direct reports, as well as our elder board, we start with conversations about our rules of life.
that's
Um,
great. And I have to believe too that now that you've been at it for a while, there's generations of that,
yeah,
of discipleship, that are doing that exact same thing. And I guess that's the thing I want to point out for those that are listening in too, is this is why you can't really you shouldn't really hurry it, and you can't really hurry it, that you're going to reproduce who you are. And if you, and I've done this part. I mean, if you reproduce this hurried life, if you reproduce a results based, outcome based only, and you know me well enough. I mean, I love a good graph up and to the right.
yeah,
All right, but if that's the only thing you want,
100%.
you're going to sabotage your own efforts. And that's,
Yes.
I mean, take a lesson, from Drew and what he's attempting to do, and through 45 years now is kind of like stuck to it, is like, no, take care of this inner, okay, and use the gifts God's given you to disciple other people, to help plant other church. And guess what? They're going to do the same thing. They're going to multiply health, which that's what a movement, that's how you create movement, which
Yes.
I think is so, 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 so exciting.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks. Keep doing the stuff.
No, thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, Dave. And you've been, again, I've loved just being able to tap you on the shoulder and ask you like how you've gone about things and helping pioneer things and doing so while still loving your family well. So I've so appreciated your voice in my life, and you've been such a model of that, what healthy reproduction and multiplication looks like. So yeah.
Hey, I'll tell you what, we got a couple minutes here, and I want to make sure I want to talk a little bit before we get done here. I want to also tell people about how they can actually, even though we're sold out at Exponential, tell them how they can actually join us if they'd like to. But before we do that, do you got a copy of your book with you?
Yeah, I
Your new
found it.
book?
Yeah,
Yeah.
here it is.
Flash the copy there. And I think maybe Andy's got a slide for us too. I got a chance to read it. I really endorse it. I really encourage everybody to pick it up. I mean, you can get it everywhere. But give us kind of the 2 minute stump speech on kind of your dream behind this and what you hope to give people as they join you kind of on this journey.
Yeah, so I wrote this book. As a pastor, I often get asked, what's Christianity all about? And so this book is basically the Christian story in three simple, memorable, accessible words. And it's beautiful, it's disappointing, and it's hopeful. And so if someone were to ask someone, what's the Christian story about? It's these three words. It's beautiful, it's disappointing, and it's hopeful. And And the Christian story, I think, is so resonant to the common human experience. So I really wrote it so that Christians would uh, be able to communicate the Christian story in three simple, memorable words, as well as there's three practices that go along with beautiful, disappointing, hopeful. That's gratitude, grief, and grace. So it's not only for Christians to learn the Christian story, but it's also for Christians, like there's discussion questions to go over. Um, right now, I've had several people tell me that they are reading it with someone who's not, doesn't come from a background of faith. And it's supposed to spark conversations because the reality is everyone deals with beauty and disappointment in life. And the question is, what do I do with all that's beautiful and disappointing? And one of the things that I find so compelling of the Christian story is that it really does give a way of viewing the world where when good things happen, we're able to respond in gratitude. When bad things happen, we understand that disappointment exists in the world and God's given us grief and different ways of approaching grief, whether it's confession and repentance or vulnerability and humility. Um, but through Jesus, we have this ultimate hope, and uh, and that hope allows us to receive His grace and give His grace to others. So yeah, so that's kind of the heart behind the book.
I didn't
And
really think about it when I was endorsing the book until now. Kind of our conversation is going full circle. I mean, in some ways, I think what the book does, and you tell me if this is part of the intention. I mean, you talked about, this the apologetic right now is how is anybody is like, if you can give me peace, I'm interested.
Mhm.
And I
Yes,
think in some ways that's what the book's exactly doing. It's going like, no, here's a path to peace, inner peace.
yeah, no, absolutely. And my hope is that because usually whenever people like, especially people who weren't Christians, asked me about Christianity, I would often think in three categories. I'd be like, oh, is this person kind of like an intellectual type who wants a book from like C.S. Lewis or Tim Keller? Again, and I love those books. Or is the person someone who maybe a memoir type of book like Anne Lamott would be helpful? Or is the person just looking for like an introduction to Christian doctrine and belief, you know? And I just realized, I think I want to write something where the words um, describe the Christian story, but they're accessible to what they experience in life. Like, why do I experience beauty and disappointment? And what do how do I deal with those things in my own life and journey? And so but I think that's exactly right. It's like, how do we have practices to deal with our everyday experiences? Um, and even disappointment. Like I realize disappointments can be one of the things that Christians have a really hard time with. Like, how can a good God allow? And part of the reason for the book is like, I mean, disappointment is part of the Christian story. And the awful part is that we're the ones who contribute to that. But this is where Jesus has come to bring a hope that doesn't come from this world, but that allows us to live and embody that kind of peace that we're talking about in the world around us. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy. And not only that, not only for yourself, but there will be, as you read it, there will be people that'll come to mind that'll you'll go, oh, they need to read this, and it's a great book to share with folks like that. Like I mentioned, Drew is going to be at Exponential just in about a month, March 18th to 20th, and he's going to be talking about greater things for your leadership. And as we've discovered, even in this conversation too, it's not just about things that are going on out there, but a lot of it, okay, is in here, and that's where it starts. It starts right inside here, and he's going to challenge us with that. It's going to be really good. We did, and we have sold out for our global conference. I think like last August, but we have an enhanced digital ticket that you can get. And one of the things that's really cool about this is that way you could actually attend it with the team. In this case, since it's digital, you don't have the cost of travel, you don't have the cost of a hotel and all those kinds of things. For those of you who do get the enhanced digital ticket, there's bonus content that you would not get if you're actually there in person. And also, I know we have a lot of people that are probably watching here that maybe you live in places, even places, other places around the world where you're going, I just can't even make it. This is how you can be a part of it. So join us. And I think we got it for 49 bucks now. I know we're going to put a limit on that, but it's 49 bucks. So you can be a part of the Exponential Global Conference that's coming up. And we also have group rates. We'll work a special deal for you on group rates. So ask about those. We'd love to make that happen for you so you can join us. All right. Um, hey, Drew, thank you very, very much. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us. And for a whole bunch of you, hope I'll see you in Orlando in just about a month. All right.